Correspondent Keith Tier partying as if it's 2027. The latest piece by a man called Leopold Aschenbrenner called Situational Awareness suggests that AGI, not just AGI, but superintelligence will arrive by 2027, and then the world will be a dramatically different and better place. But not everyone, of course, shares that kind of optimistic techno-futurism. Our guest today on the show is not in Silicon Valley. She's in Edinburgh, where she teaches at the university. And she's the author of a new book, The AI Mirror: How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Learning. Shannon Vallor is joining us, as I said, from Edinburgh. Shannon, a lot of talk here about sentient technology. My sense is you don't really believe in that future, do you?
Well, I think there's two questions here. One is, are we talking about technologies that we might build in the future, or are we talking about the development into sentience of the kinds of technologies that we're building today? So the first thing I am actually agnostic about. I don't see any reason in principle why it would be impossible to build a sentient machine. I don't think we have any idea how to do that. And I don't think the technologies that we're building today and the kinds of algorithms and techniques that we're using today have any prospect of bringing us toward sentience. So I think if we want to build sentient machines, we'll have to go about it very differently than we're building AI technologies today.
What do you make of, though, the perpetual promise in Silicon Valley from everybody from, I don't know, all the big tech people, and then latest, this Leopold Aschenbrenner every week seems to throw up a new person, about the promise of AGI and superintelligence? Is there a metaphysical explanation? Are these people just hardcore utopians? Are they turning technology into a religion?
I think some of them fit that description, not all. For others, it's, I think, a marketing proposition. It's much more exciting to imagine that AGI is on the horizon than to imagine that the technologies that we're building today might not get dramatically better than what we're seeing. But I do think some people are true believers, and true believers for reasons that aren't based on scientific evidence, but deeper, more philosophical commitments to the idea that technology inevitably directs itself towards something like AGI. And that is almost a religious commitment, because there's no scientific evidence that that's in fact the case. So I think there's a mix. I think there are also people, I'll put some people in a third category, where the idea just seems so attractive and exciting to them that they embrace the optimism, not because they have any deep, deep belief that it must happen, but that it's just what they'd like to see happen. So I think there's a mix. But it's absolutely not the case that everyone in Silicon Valley believes that AGI is around the corner. It's just that the people who say this tend to be invested very heavily in that prospect. And also the narrative is very attractive in the media. So that's what gets picked up. But there are many sober voices saying, actually, I don't think AGI is around the corner at all. There's no evidence that's the case. And I would need to see something very different to believe that. But and I'm talking about senior researchers working in big tech companies who hold this more sober view. But no one is going to take their more modest prediction or skepticism and highlight it in a flashy news article. It doesn't sell. It doesn't get clicks, right? So when I go around and talk to folks in the AI community, there's a much more diverse spectrum of beliefs around sentience and AGI than what the media perspective on Silicon Valley would suggest.
Gary Marcus has been on the show. He's an old friend, so I assume you would. I mean, he's not based in Silicon Valley. He's
no, I know Gary. Yeah,
he's very influential. The guy who comes to mind most of all in all this is Ray Kurzweil. He was on the show a few years ago. I know you've been also. I was surprised that you were critical of Jeff Hinton. You had an X about him recently, suggesting you're not
Yep.
sharing an interview. I'm quoting him. I'm quoting you here. You said that guy veered so far out of his intellectual lane that he self-launched over a ravine and still thinks he's flying. Hinton was one of the very senior AI people to actually resign, it seems, from Google over some of Google's latest AI initiatives. What does your criticism of Hinton tell us about some of the ethics or lack of ethics of senior AI people in Silicon Valley? Or is it just particularly Hinton that you're pissed at?
I'm not pissed at him. I don't
Well,
have
disappointed or angry, or you just
no,
not
I think
willing to
it's
acknowledge.
none of those things. No, it's just an observation that he has made claims that are incredibly misleading. So, from a scientific perspective, it's important that people point that out. And this is the phenomenon where you have someone who is an expert in a very narrow domain, but they then become convinced that they actually have expertise in things like neuroscience and the science of consciousness and emotion. So that tweet was in response to a recent interview he gave, where he had made claims that the systems that we're building now have emotional states that they can feel things like fear, um, and the description of emotion that he's giving is so far detached from the scientific reality of what emotions are, right? But he's completely unaware of this, and he thinks, without any kind of sense of humility or attempt to actually engage the science of emotion, he's making these vast, incredibly baseless claims about AI tools sharing emotions with us when they lack any of the actual capacities that emotion entails. So that was the basis of my tweet, was basically saying, look, this guy doesn't realize how far out of his intellectual lane he is, right? I'm someone who's not going to start opining in an interview about, let's say, quantum mechanics and what it implies for the nature of reality or consciousness, because that's not my field. But Hinton feels very comfortable opining about areas of expertise that he lacks. And I think that's something that's very tempting to do when the technologies that you have built, or that you have at least provided some of the scientific and technical foundations for building, then become very, very powerful very quickly. So I can understand how it happens, but it is important to point out when people are extending their claims beyond the knowledge that they have.
Speaking of intellectual lanes, your publisher describes you, I don't know whether you share this idea, that you're an ethicist. How would you define yourself? On your website, you call yourself a philosopher of AI. Are you an expert in ethics? Is that your intellectual lane?
It's one of my areas of expertise. Yes, I've been writing on the ethics of emerging technologies for almost 20 years now.
So how do technologies have ethics?
Well, first of all, ethics is a human activity. So technologies themselves don't have ethics, but technologies are extensions of human power, judgment, decision making, and choice. And so technologies are instruments, among many others, that humans use to express their values and enable their values to be pursued in the world. So technologies can't be ethically neutral or value neutral, because every technology is based on certain decisions by humans about what's worth doing, what's worth enabling, what's worth pursuing. And those are value judgments. So the value judgments that we make, whether they're moral values, whether they're economic values, whether they're aesthetic values, whether they're intellectual values, and those things are all usually entangled, right? Those value judgments shape the technologies, and they shape what those technologies do in the world. And then when the technology gets into the world, other values intertwine with it. Instead of the values of just the designers and producers of the technology, it's the technology's interaction with users and communities and society that then shapes its ethical significance in new directions. So we've seen many examples in the past, right, of technologies that were designed for one purpose, to enable one set of values to be pursued, that then got introduced and society started using it in different ways to enable different kinds of things, right? And so the values that the technology actually enabled were quite different. So if you think about social media, just as a very recent example, right? The use of social media as a tool of disinformation was not part of the original design intent, right? It wasn't one of the intent to enable deception and manipulation wasn't part of the design values that were baked into social media technologies. But because they landed in contexts where that was enabled by the technology and where deception and manipulation could be used to generate economic and political value, then people began to use those tools in order to pursue those goals, right? As well as the goals of information sharing and community building that the people who originally built these platforms were hoping they would be used for. So we know that technologies aren't morally neutral. We know that they reflect not only the values of their designers, but also the values of their users and the societies around them.
But doesn't technology often have unintentional consequences, as you're suggesting? That you never can quite tell how things are going to work out. Social media was created by, in some ways, I don't know, networked idealists who believe that everyone should have a voice and everyone should be able to connect with everyone else. And it's turned into this sort of panopticon-like surveillance network. No one knew that. Was that inevitably baked in?
No. I'm sorry. Lots of people knew it. I was there at the time, and there were lots of people pointing out the ways that these technologies would be likely to be exploited and used for dangerous purposes, as well as the more benign purposes. And it was simply that those people were not on the covers of magazines. Those people weren't selling books at airports, right? Those were serious internet.
Who were
internet
they? Who comes to mind with social media, for example?
Myself as one of them. I was writing about social media technology back in 2010, and there were lots of other people before me. Actually, I mean, I'm happy to send you separately a list of names, but the body of internet researchers who work at the intersection of media studies and ethics of information technology, those folks have been around for decades. People like Dana Boyd, people like Kate Crawford, people that have very carefully understood the affordances and powers of these technologies and asked very early on platforms to take greater care to mitigate the harms that they foresaw, especially surveillance arms. I mean, that was the first thing that people noticed that these technologies would enable. But the optimism that really drives the economics of technology marketing, and that is also something very appealing from a media standpoint, drowned out all those warnings. And in fact, many of the researchers who pointed out the potential dangers of social media technologies were dismissed as Luddites, were dismissed as people who didn't understand technology, when in fact, in hindsight, it's clear that they understood it better than anyone else.
Are you a technological determinist then, or is there still room for us with agency in terms of shaping these technologies for our own interest? I know your first book, the one before AI Mirror, and we're going to come to that after the break more specifically, was Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting, and I guess also worth achieving. So there's nothing in, are you, in your view of technology, is there anything inevitable about the way these things work out? Are you suggesting that had the marketing people not been so powerful, then social media might have had a quite different sort of history?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the antithesis of a technological determinist. Technologies are extensions of human power and choice, and human power and choice is always something that allows for indeterminacy and uncertainty and for change. And we've seen many examples of that throughout human history, where the dominant powers shifted in response to resistance, to critique, to new powers arising. And the horizon of technology has never been fixed. It's always open. And the only people who have an interest in telling you that the future of technology is already decided are people who don't want you to change it. They're people who want you to believe that the bus is driving itself and you're at the back and you're just a passenger and you just have to hope that it takes you somewhere nice. What they absolutely don't want you to recognize is that there is someone at the wheel and they don't want you to grab it. And there's always those of us at the wheel, large technology companies, governments, the other kinds of powerful actors that can shape technology policy very much are at the wheel. And whether they act or do not act, these are human decisions that the language of technological determinism tries to conceal.
We are speaking with Shannon Vallor, the author of The AI Mirror. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Shannon are brought to us because of our friends at the Disorder podcast, excellent new podcast on the global disorder, including the technological disorder that Shannon Vallor is talking about. Going to run a short feature on the excellent Disorder podcast, and then we'll be back with Shannon to talk specifically about her new book, The AI Mirror. So don't go away, anyone. We're watching you.
Not working together anymore?
The United States, some European societies, are so divided.
And that we lurch from one crisis to the next without any coherent vision from our leaders.
There is this big space of disorder, and we're just kind of holding up our hands and going, well, don't know what we could do.
If so, Disorder, co-produced by Gullhanger, is the podcast for you. Every Tuesday, we bring together some of the world's leading thinkers to unpack our new era of global enduring disorder. And we move beyond the headlines to actually propose solutions out of this mess in our Ordering the Disorder segment.
How do you repair disorder? It's by becoming a community.
Search Disorder in your podcast app to listen right now.
Strongly recommended, as is strongly recommended, Shannon Vallor's new book, The AI Mirror. Shannon, we talked implicitly, at least, about the idea of technology as a mirror in the first part of the show. Let's address concretely, specifically, what you're arguing in this book. Is all this new AI technology from companies like OpenAI, is it just a mirror? Does it reflect the current values of our society?
It reflects the dominant values of a certain subset of society, those of us that are most heavily represented in the training data for these systems. And that is a concern that I raise in the book, that we think about these technologies as reflections of human intelligence, but they're actually reflections of the intelligence that's represented most heavily in the training data. So they are not universal representations of humanity or reflections of human intelligence. But at least we're getting closer to the truth when we see them as reflections of human intelligence than when we see them as alien minds or new kinds of intelligence that are emerging in the world almost by some sort of technological magic. So what my book seeks to do is to really help the reader get a more realistic grasp on what these technologies do and how they do it, what their capabilities are and what their limitations are, what benefits they can bring, but also what risks they pose to us. But most importantly, to ensure that the reader is able to maintain a scientifically grounded distinction between the reflections and images of intelligence that appear in these technological mirrors and the actual expressions of intelligence that we produce and that in fact enable these technologies to produce their reflections. So if you think about a mirror, right? If you look in your bedroom mirror and you understand what you're looking at, you understand that there isn't a body on the other side of that mirror, right? You understand that there's not a second person staring back at you. Now, if you have a cat, cats are particularly good at this, sometimes dogs, they will often begin to fight with their own reflection in the mirror because they may not recognize that that reflection is in fact themselves or just a sort of phantom. They actually think there's another animal on the other side of the glass. When we become confused about AI tools, when marketing, for example, begins to convince us that these technologies actually are conscious, feeling, with minds of their own, we're like the cat who's fighting the other cat in the glass. We become confused about the distinction between reflection and material reality. And so the book is really about puncturing that illusion so that we can maintain a proper understanding of what these tools are. Mirrors are very useful. And so the book is not about AI somehow being inherently destructive or inherently threatening to human well-being. Quite the opposite. The better we understand what these tools are and what they aren't, the more capable we will be of using them to enhance the human experience, to strengthen our communities, to enable human flourishing. But if we get lost in the mirror illusion, and I use in the book the old myth of Narcissus in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Narcissus becomes confused by his reflection in a mirrored lake, and actually his own life is lost to that illusion because he becomes so obsessed with this beautiful boy he thinks he sees in the water, which is in fact himself, and so in love and entranced with this other boy that he sees reflected, that he won't leave. He won't leave the image behind. He won't attend to his own needs. And we see sometimes examples of humans becoming so in love with the illusion of AI sentience or AI consciousness that they begin to actually make decisions that aren't beneficial for themselves. And so the book is really about trying to bring us back to a grounded reality that will actually enable us to use these tools wisely and well.
So what is that reality, Shannon? Your local newspaper suggested that you're calling for a revolution against tech billionaires. But what is the
I
current?
think if you actually read the piece, you'll see I actually never said that. If you know anything about headlines, you know that they're
Yeah,
not even
well, as I said,
written by
it was the headline, but certainly you're not a great friend of big tech. I wonder, in your view, the AI landscape is complicated. There are a number of companies, some claiming to be more moral than others. OpenAI, which started as a nonprofit, now is very much a for-profit. Google, of course, Anthropic. Some of the founders of OpenAI just split off to form a more, what they claim, ethical AI startup. Should we distinguish between some of these AI companies, or are they basically all in the same camp, in your view?
You know, I think what's much more powerful in the corporate ecosystem than individual personalities is the incentives that these organizations are driven by. And all of these AI companies today are driven by the same incentives. They see themselves as locked in a commercial race to consolidate and secure a competitive advantage in a market that no one knows whether it's peaking or whether it's just the beginning of a long commercial growth. And so these companies are locked in an internal battle for commercial dominance that affects their behavior in ways that then have knock-on effects and may cause collateral damage for the rest of society, which is frankly the same phenomenon we see everywhere in market economies, right? It's why climate change, which doesn't really benefit anyone in the long term, is not being addressed. Why? Because the short-term incentives that companies have do not motivate them to support an actual green transition in the short term. It motivates them to get as much profit now as possible before things get really bad. You have a similar sort of dynamic in the AI ecosystem, where there is no incentive for thinking about how to make sure that AI doesn't, for example, undermine our capacity to respond to climate change. There's a lot of indications right now that the demand for data centers is nearly doubling as a result of the kind of AI craze right now, and the reliance on very carbon hungry large language models and foundation models. So the incentives aren't there. It's really not about whether individual people in these companies have good intentions or not. It's the interest of the shareholders that they are incentivized to promote, and in some cases legally bound to promote. And until we change those incentives for them, we shouldn't really expect to get any real alignment of the AI ecosystem with human well-being. That's just not what. That's just not where the money is going right now.
Are you, in a sense, then just basically kicking the can down the road? You're suggesting that nothing much is going to change until we alter, perhaps dramatically, the architecture of market capitalism?
Well, no, I don't actually think that it has to be an all or nothing approach. And in fact, if you go back just 50 years and look at the tax structure and the regulatory structure that impacted innovation leaders like Boeing, right? You had a very different sort of picture, a very different sort of cultures, was still a market economy, was still essentially a capitalist enterprise, but you had closer alignment with human safety and well-being in many ways than you do now. So think about, the culture and practices of Boeing in the 1990s, let's say, versus or 80s versus what you see today and the effects on public trust and on safety that have resulted. So we have a lot of movement within capitalism between regulatory capture and neglect at one extreme and kind of over regulation or counterproductive regulation on the other extreme. And then there's lots of room in the middle, right, for sensible, reasonable regulation and governance and adjustment of market incentives to allow companies that operate responsibly to make more money and to have, for example, their civil liabilities capped in case there is a bad outcome, right? No technology is completely risk-free. No technology can be guaranteed to be 100% safe, but you can reward companies for developing and marketing technologies in responsible ways. We do it in all kinds of safety critical industries, right? We have a reasonably well-governed, depending on what country you're in, market for medical treatments and medical devices, just to give one example. We have lots of regulations around building construction. And why do we have those? We have those because for much of the early 20th century, buildings kept falling over on people because they were shoddily constructed with poor materials by people cutting corners to make money. And eventually, it became part of the regulatory interest to constrain that, right? And this is why, for example, in the United States, you don't have schools falling down on kids' heads every week, the way that can happen very easily in countries without that kind of regulatory infrastructure. So no, you don't have to fix capitalism all in one go. There's lots of low-hanging fruit that we're simply not picking because of regulatory capture, because of lobbying, and because of, frankly, a kind of political apathy that has taken over, where voters don't feel empowered to demand better governance and better leadership on these issues. But that's something that can change too. And that's something that ebbs and flows in history as well. So you go through periods where publics are very detached, very cynical, not exercising their rights or demanding them. And then you go through periods where people kind of wake up and say, you know what, we actually can't accept this anymore. So I do think that we may see that happen in the AI ecosystem, and there's signs of it happening already. There's a lot of resistance around AI that's happening. You see a lot of artists, for example, beginning to mobilize and form partnerships that refuse the use of AI. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the goal that we should embrace, where we sort of say, no one can use this technology at all and call themselves a responsible artist. But that's what you'll get if you don't have more responsible deployment and governance of these technologies. You'll get reactive public refusal of the technology. You see, we did this with GMOs in Europe, right? GMOs, people talk about technology as inevitable. It's not inevitable. GMOs became verboten in much of Europe because people decided, even though in fact, on balance, they can be an incredibly beneficial technology, and they can help us address things like food insecurity and climate stresses on agriculture. But their use is constrained now because of public distrust and suspicion around them. I don't want to see that happen to AI, but that's what will happen if we don't actually govern the technology appropriately.
The subtitle of your book, The AI Mirror, is How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Learning. What does
machine thinking, not machine learning.
In an age of machine thinking, right? Sorry. How to reclaim our humanity in an age of machine thinking. What do you mean by humanity?
Well, first of all, let me say what I mean by machine thinking, because it's a little bit of a trick there. Machines don't actually think. And I'll give you an example if you need something to back that up. But when I speak of an age of machine thinking, I'm speaking about the long-standing mechanization of the human personality and the effort to turn our thinking into something mechanical, something predictable, something controllable, and something optimizable. And so an age of machine thinking is actually about what happens to human thought and human judgment when we are encouraged to behave more like machines than people, and when we're judged and valued based on how close we can approximate the productivity and predictability of a machine. So that's what the book is saying. With respect to our humanity, that includes all the richer dimensions of the human personality beyond our ability to efficiently produce economically valuable outputs, right? So that includes things like human expression, both emotional expression and artistic expression, political expression. It includes things like love and care. It includes the dimensions of human wisdom, judgment, discretion, perspective. It includes things like moral imagination, right? So there's a laundry list of human capabilities that are not, in fact, realized by machines, but that are increasingly devalued, because increasingly the only human activities and capabilities that are seen as valuable are those that can be replicated by machines and that can be converted to economically valuable units. And that's not something that's new to AI, right? This is a battle that's been going on since the era of industrialization. It's just that AI is a new tool that's being used to consolidate the mechanization of human thought and the reduction of the human personality to the profile of a machine. And that's what the book is about: how to resist that, how to refuse that, and how to choose, in fact, a world where the full span of the human personality is enabled and supported and sustained.
it reminds me a little bit of Marx's German ideology, the idea that we can reclaim our humanity against the machine. Can machines help us, though? Can some of this technology be used as a platform to enable the flourishing, the reclamation of our humanity? And how does that actually work? I mean, it's all very well talked. I mean, this is all quite inspiring, but it's a rather vague. What would actually need to happen?
Well, so I'm not going to detail every example given in the book, but in the book there are lots of examples of how we can use technology to actually enable human flourishing and promote the enrichment of the human personality. I'll give you just a couple of examples right now. So one of the most remarkable aspects of AI technologies that we have today is their greatly enhanced translation capabilities. So for years, we used to dream of the technology of a universal translator. If you're a big nerd like me and you grew up on things like Star Trek, right? The idea of people being able to seamlessly communicate across cultural and linguistic boundaries was seen as the kind of hallmark of perhaps a more just and sustainable future for humanity. Now, it was always an oversimplification because languages cannot ever be translated into one other without remainder or loss, right? But the very fact is that English-speaking human beings have a considerable economic and political advantage today that is often used to the disadvantage of those from non-English speaking and particularly non-European language backgrounds. And these technologies actually allow for a rebalancing of the power of language. We are actually getting much closer to being able to use these technologies to be capable of translating what we call low resource languages, where we don't have as much language data as we do in English. These technologies are getting better at actually being able to produce quality translation across a vast diversity of languages. And that's going to enable, for example, students in a university like the University of Edinburgh, where I teach, where we have a large body of international students coming in. We're getting very close to the point where the students in my course for whom English is not their first language will not be at an immediate disadvantage as a result of that, and will be able, thanks to AI, to have my lectures translated into their own in a way that is relatively seamless and instantaneous. And I think that kind of technology is something that we can embrace in lots of contexts. It also helps a number of people who have language processing disabilities, right? For example, for some people, it takes longer for them to process language. And we can imagine these technologies being used to support a wider range of learning capabilities and styles. But that's not how we're using them, right? That's not how they're being used for education right now. Those aren't the priorities. They're being used to automate education labor, and they're being used to automate the parts of education that are actually most critical for humans to perform, right? They're being used to automate the production of essays, and they're being encouraged to use to review and evaluate other people's work. So we see the example of scientific peer review now being affected by ChatGPT generated submissions, and also ChatGPT generated peer reviews, which is resulting in an absolute endangerment of the scientific quality of our peer review system. So it's not about the technology being inherently destructive. It's about the fact that we don't have the guardrails to ensure that we're making careful distinctions between technologies that actually enhance what we're there to do, to learn in that example, or to produce new scientific insights, and the uses of technology that simply save cost or time, but actually degrade the output. We can use technologies, for example, to improve our ability to detect financial corruption and political corruption in the international finance system. But many of these technologies aren't being used to chase white-collar criminals or detect political corruption by elites, because that doesn't make powerful people more money, right? But what it is being used to do is to identify and in many cases falsely accuse people on public benefits, the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. These technologies have repeatedly been used for benefits fraud detection, for people on disability benefits, for people on childcare benefits, or receiving unemployment benefits. And the technologies often work terribly in those cases and produce large numbers of false positives that deprive people of their rights. But again, that's because the incentives are not aligned with what we want or should want.
So who
So
determines, Shannon, who determines these incentives? You clearly have your own, I wouldn't say political agenda, but strong political views. I'm sure not everybody would share them.
Doesn't everyone have
Who's
strong
going to
political
determine that, how these things are used?
the people who are most affected by them. I mean, the principle of democracy, which is something that I still believe quite passionately in, is the principle that it is those who are governed who have the right to consent to that governance, who have the right to shape the form of that governance, who have the right to have not just a voice, but a say in how they're governed. And so the incentives that govern our financial system are within the purview of democratic publics. And any system which denies wider publics the ability to shape the incentives that govern their lives is undemocratic and fundamentally unjust.
So finally coming back to AI, the UK is about to have a general election. Should the issue of AI be something that the voters will be deciding, regulating companies like OpenAI or Google? Should that be determined in elections?
I think that voters should be demanding that the representatives that they elect have a well-developed platform that dictates how they plan to responsibly govern and regulate technology companies, their power. And also, it's not just about the big technology companies, it's also the sort of small actors and some actors who are kind of outside of the corporate ecosystem who can weaponize these technologies to cause harm. So we shouldn't get over focused on the large technology companies. That is probably the biggest power issue to address. But there are also lots of other dangers in the AI ecosystem that we have to pay attention to. The risks of using AI, for example, to advance bioterrorism or financial fraud, right? So the criminal uses of AI, we also have to pay attention to. And I would absolutely expect any party who wants to be elected in the UK or anywhere else to have a statement on how they will address those concerns. Now, should AI probably be at the top of the priority list in a country where the NHS is on its knees? Perhaps not, right? It is not that AI is the only issue that people should be concerned about. And I think, in fact, the kind of framing of AI as an existential risk that threatens humanity is often used as a distraction from more pressing political concerns around things like the response to climate change and economic inequality and the unsustainability of critical infrastructure and health systems, right? All of that needs to matter. But yes, I absolutely would expect any political party worth its salt to be able to talk about how they're going to ensure that technology companies are held accountable for the effects of their technologies on society and its institutions and the communities who depend on them.
Much to think about. I want to thank you, Shannon Vallor, the author of The AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. I was going to say machine learning, but it's machine thinking. That's something we talked about. Shannon, good luck with the book. And thank you so much for appearing on Keen On. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me.